this is the path that we go down.
Down the hill. 2 words, recorded almost by accident on a phone that was never meant to capture anything more than an afternoon between friends. Flat, unhurried. The kind of thing a stranger might say while giving directions, not the kind of thing you'd expect from a man about to become the center of one of the largest manhunts in American history. For nearly 6 years, that recording was almost all anyone had. No name, no clear face, just a few seconds of grainy video and a voice that said exactly 4 syllables before falling silent again. Investigators studied it. Amateur sleuths slowed it down, sped it up, picked it apart syllable by syllable, convinced that somewhere in those 2 words was a clue nobody had noticed yet. They were right. They just had no idea how long it would take, or how strange the path to that answer would turn out to be. There is a photograph that goes along with that recording, one that most people who have spent any time on the internet in the last several years have seen, even if they never knew its name. A man on a bridge, a hood up, hands in his pockets, walking with no particular urgency, the way anyone walks when they don't yet know they're being watched. For years, that photograph had no name attached to it. It had a nickname instead, Bridge Guy. A nickname was easier to say out loud than the truth, which was that nobody knew who he was, and 2 teenage girls were dead because of him. This is the story of what happened on an old railroad bridge in a small Indiana town on a Monday afternoon in February 2017. It's the story of the 5 years, 8 months, and countless sleepless nights it took to put a name to that recording. It's the story of a community that refused to stop looking, of a single overlooked document that sat buried in a file cabinet while an entire country searched for answers, and of a legal case that, even now, with a verdict delivered and a sentence handed down, is still not finished being argued. It starts, like so many of these stories do, with something completely ordinary. Delphi, Indiana is not a place that makes headlines. It's a town of roughly 3,000 people, about an hour north of Indianapolis, the kind of place where everyone has at least a passing familiarity with everyone else, and where the biggest news in a given month might be a school board decision or a shift in the weather. On the edge of town runs an old abandoned railroad line, converted into a public trail, crossing a high wooden trestle bridge that generations of local kids have walked, biked, and dared each other across. It's called the Monon High Bridge Trail. And on February 13th, 2017, it was where 2 best friends decided to spend an unexpected day off from school. Liberty German, Libby, to everyone who knew her, was 14 years old, an 8th grader at Delphi Community Middle School. Abigail Williams, Abby, was 13, a year behind Libby, but every bit her equal in friendship. By every account that has come out of Delphi in the years since, the 2 of them were inseparable, the kind of friends who don't need a plan for a snow day, because being together is the plan. School had closed for the weather, and instead of staying home, the girls chose to do something they had probably done dozens of times before: walk the trail, take some pictures, enjoy an afternoon that belonged to no one but them. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it's tempting for a story like this one to rush past the ordinariness of it on the way to the tragedy. That would be a mistake. Nothing about that morning was unusual. Nothing about the decision to hike a trail they knew by heart suggested danger, and that is exactly what makes this story so hard to let go of, even all these years later. There was no warning sign, just 2 girls doing something safe and familiar on a day that had no reason to become historic. They were dropped off at the trailhead that morning, with a plan to be picked up later that evening. For most of the day, by every indication, it was exactly the kind of afternoon they had hoped for. So what went wrong, and exactly when? Sometime around midday, a woman later identified in court records by the surname Carbaugh reported seeing a man on the bridge. She gave a description of his build, his clothing, the way he carried himself. At the time, it seemed like an unremarkable detail in an unremarkable day. It would take 7 years, a full criminal trial, and an appellate proceeding for the exact wording of that description, and how faithfully it was recorded and later represented, to become one of the most contested details in the entire case. But that fight was still years away. Then came the moment this entire story turns on. At some point that same afternoon, Libby's phone captured something. A short video, grainy, brief, unremarkable to look at, showing a man walking on the bridge, approaching the girls. Near the end of the clip, a voice is heard. 2 words, down the hill, flat, unhurried. It was the first time that recording entered the world. No context, no name attached, just a phrase that would go on to outlive the moment it was spoken in and follow the case for years. Nobody knows exactly what Libby was thinking when she pressed record. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was simply a habit of documenting an afternoon out with her best friend, the way so many teenagers do. Whatever the reason, it turned out to be the last thing she would ever leave behind, for the people who loved her, and eventually, for an entire country that would spend years staring at those 15 seconds of footage, trying to find something in it that wasn't there. That evening, Libby's father arrived at the spot where he expected to pick up his daughter and her best friend. They weren't there. No message, no sign of where they'd gone. In a small town, this is the moment that turns an ordinary evening cold, the silence where a familiar voice should be. A search began that night, and it did not take long to become something far more serious than 2 teenagers losing track of time. The next day, February 14th, search parties found the bodies of both girls. They were about a quarter-mile from the bridge, on private property near a creek, not far in the geography of the place, but far enough that whoever left them there had made a deliberate choice about where. Prosecutors would later tell a jury that both girls had suffered fatal injuries to the throat. This account will not go further into the physical details of what was done to them. It doesn't need to. The point of this story isn't to dwell on the violence inflicted on 2 children. It's to understand what happened next, and what it eventually took to answer for it. Abby and Libby deserve to be remembered as 2 friends who went for a walk, not reduced to the manner of their deaths. Within days, Indiana State Police, working alongside the Carroll County Sheriff's Office, released what little they had. The photo from the bridge, and the recording of that voice saying, "Down the hill." It was, in essence, everything and nothing. A face turned partially away, 2 words now public, waiting for someone somewhere to recognize the voice behind them. An entire country was about to spend the better part of a decade staring at both, searching for a face that refused to come into focus. What followed became one of the largest public investigations in the history of American true crime. Thousands of tips poured in, some useful, most not, all of them requiring someone to read, log, and follow up. Composite sketches were released, studied by the public, revised, released again, studied again. Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter became something like the public heartbeat of the case, appearing at press conference after press conference over the years, delivering some version of the same message each time. We have not forgotten these girls. We are still working this case. Someone out there knows something. Behind the scenes, the investigation was carried by people whose names the public would come to know well before this was over. Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett and Indiana State Police Master Trooper Brian Harshman among them, working a case that refused to resolve itself no matter how much manpower and public attention was thrown at it. Carroll County Prosecutor Nick McClelland would eventually bring the case to trial, but that was still years away. For a long stretch of time, years, not months, there was no suspect, just a photo, a recording, and an entire community trying to live ordinary lives in the shadow of an unsolved double murder that had made their town a permanent fixture on the national news. It's difficult to overstate what those years did to Delphi, and to the families of the 2 girls in particular. Libby's grandparents, Mike and Becky Patty, became the most consistent public voices connected to the case, appearing in interviews, keeping the story alive during years when it would have been easy for the rest of the country to move on. Grief, in a case like this, doesn't get the luxury of resolution. It has to coexist with waiting. Every anniversary of the girls' deaths became both a memorial and a reminder that whoever was responsible was still out there, possibly still walking the same streets as the people mourning. And outside of Delphi, something else was happening. An enormous, sprawling amateur investigation was taking shape online, with an intensity that, by some measures, outpaced the resources of the official investigation itself. Timelines were built and rebuilt. Theories were proposed, argued over, discarded, revived. That 15-second recording, those same two words, was analyzed and reanalyzed, slowed down, pitched up, picked apart syllable by syllable by people convinced that investigators had missed something hiding in plain sound. None of it produced a name. What it produced instead was a strange kind of collective vigil, a case that refused to fade from public memory precisely because so many people had decided, individually and collectively, that they weren't going to let it. For more than 5 years, that's where things stood. A photo, a recording, a community that couldn't look away. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet, an answer that nobody knew was already there. By 2022, the sheer scale of the tip line had become its own kind of problem. Thousands of leads, gathered over years, needed to be organized, cross-referenced, and reviewed, a task large enough that volunteers were brought in to help manage the backlog. One of them was a woman named Kathy Shank. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't running the investigation. She was doing the unglamorous, essential work of sorting through old paperwork, trying to make sense of years of accumulated leads. And somewhere in that pile, she found something that had been mislabeled. A lead sheet, filed away, essentially invisible since shortly after the murders themselves. The report came from an Indiana conservation officer. According to it, just 3 days after the murders, while the search for the killer was still in its earliest, most urgent days, a local man had approached the officer in a grocery store parking lot and, almost in passing, mentioned that he had been on the trail the day the girls disappeared. He said he had walked past 3 girls, not 2, 3, a detail that would later require its own explanation, but at the time it seemed like nothing more than an offhand comment from a local resident cooperating with an investigation. That man was Richard Allen, a pharmacy technician at the Delphi CVS, a husband, a face that most people in town would have recognized without a second thought, the kind of ordinary presence that draws no attention precisely because it belongs. His statement, voluntary, unprompted, given freely to a conservation officer who had no reason at the time to treat it as significant, had been sitting in a file for roughly 5 years. Nobody had connected it to the murders. Nobody had followed up. It existed, technically, as part of the investigative record almost from the very beginning, and it took an accident of paperwork organization, years later, for anyone to look at it again with fresh eyes. It's hard to know exactly what to do with a fact like that. On one hand, it's the story of a case being solved, proof that persistence, even years later, can produce an answer. On the other hand, it raises a question with no comfortable resolution. If that lead sheet had been properly flagged back in 2017, would 5 years of searching, 5 years of a killer walking free, 5 years of a town living under the weight of an unanswered question have been avoidable? This documentary can't answer that. Neither, fully, can the case itself. It remains one of the more uncomfortable threads in the entire Delphi story, sitting alongside roughly a dozen other questions that are still unresolved, even now. In October 2022, Indiana State Police arrested Richard Allen. For a case that had gone cold for so long, the shift was almost dizzying. A name existed now, a face, a person the public could finally attach to years of speculation. And immediately, the story of Delphi changed shape, from an open mystery into a criminal prosecution, with all the different rules, different evidence, and different scrutiny that come with it. But an arrest is not a conviction. What came next would decide whether that recording, that photograph, and that overlooked lead sheet were enough to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, who had said those 2 words. Prosecutors built their case around several pillars. They alleged that Allen had forced the 2 girls down the hill near the bridge at gunpoint, before killing them with a knife. Central to the physical evidence was a .40 caliber unspent bullet found near where the girls' bodies were discovered, a piece of evidence prosecutors said ballistics analysis tied directly to a handgun owned by Allen. It became, in many ways, the single most argued-over object in the entire case, a small piece of metal that either connected a man to a crime scene beyond reasonable doubt, or didn't, depending entirely on which side of the courtroom you were sitting on. Beyond the physical evidence, prosecutors presented something far more unusual and far more disputed. They told the jury that while in custody awaiting trial, Allen confessed to the murders more than 60 times. Not once, in a single dramatic breakdown, but repeatedly, over an extended period, to a range of different people: his wife, his mother, prison psychologists, corrections staff, even fellow inmates. Several of these admissions were recorded, and portions were played for the jury during trial. In closing arguments, the prosecution went further still, identifying Allen directly as the man captured on that bridge, the man whose voice had said those two words 7 years earlier, closing for them the years-long gap between an anonymous recording and a named defendant. It would be easy, hearing all of that laid out in sequence, to assume the case was airtight. It wasn't. Allen's defense spent the trial working to dismantle nearly every piece of that narrative, and did so with arguments serious enough that they remain, to this day, at the center of an active appeal. So what did the defense actually argue, and how much of it should we believe? The defense never disputed that Allen had been on the trail that day. He'd said as much himself, voluntarily, back in 2017. What they disputed was everything built on top of that single fact. They pointed out forcefully that no DNA evidence connected Allen to the crime scene. None. And no DNA belonging to either girl was found on any item recovered from his home. In a case built so heavily on forensic and testimonial narrative, the absence of that kind of physical link was, for the defense, a glaring hole they worked to keep in front of the jury at every opportunity. They also went after the ballistics evidence directly, challenging how it had been documented and handled, and raising alternative explanations for how a bullet might have ended up at the scene without necessarily proving Allen had fired a weapon there. And then there were the confessions, the more than 60 admissions that formed the emotional and narrative core of the prosecution's case. The defense argued these weren't reliable confessions at all. They said Allen had experienced a psychotic episode brought on by months of prolonged solitary confinement while awaiting trial, and that whatever he said during that period reflected a mind in crisis, not a truthful account of what happened on that bridge. It's a difficult argument to sit with either way. The idea that isolation itself might produce false admissions of guilt, or the idea that a defense might reach for that explanation to explain away real ones. The jury had to decide which one they believed, and so, eventually, will the appellate court. The defense tried one more avenue during trial, an alternative suspect theory involving claims about a local group described as Odinists, which they hoped might introduce reasonable doubt about who was actually responsible. Special Judge Francis Gull ruled that evidence inadmissible, keeping it from ever reaching the jury, a decision the defense has continued to challenge in the years since, and one that remains a live issue in the current appeal. The trial itself ran for roughly a month, conducted under unusually tight restrictions. Cameras were banned from the courtroom, and reporters faced strict limits on their devices, a reflection of just how much public attention the case still commanded, even years after the murders themselves. A 12-person jury sat through weeks of testimony. Forensic experts, investigators, family members, and recordings of Allen's own words, played back to them in a courtroom instead of a prison cell. After about 19 hours of deliberation, spread across 3 or 4 days, they reached a verdict. On November 11, 2024, Richard Allen was found guilty on all 4 counts. 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felony murder. On December 20th of that same year, he was sentenced to 130 years in prison. Under Indiana law, a sentence of that length, tied to multiple murder convictions, leaves him ineligible for parole. Barring a successful appeal, Richard Allen will spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the first time since 2017, a gag order that had kept investigators, attorneys, and families from speaking publicly about the case was lifted. Libby's grandparents, Mike and Becky Patty, who had carried the public weight of this case almost by default for years, were finally able to speak freely about what the verdict meant to them. It wasn't a resolution in any complete sense. Nothing about a courtroom verdict brings back what was lost on that bridge. But after nearly 8 years of living inside an unanswered question, it was, for the families and for the town of Delphi, something, a place to stand, even if the ground still felt unsteady. But the story doesn't end with a verdict. Not quite. Community reaction in Delphi mixed relief with something more complicated. For years, this small town had lived under a kind of low, constant hum of national attention. Reporters, amateur investigators, true crime tourists occasionally showing up at the bridge itself. A verdict didn't erase 8 years of that scrutiny. Nor did it erase the enduring question of how a report tied directly to the man ultimately convicted sat unnoticed in a file cabinet for half a decade. Relief and unease in Delphi have had to coexist, and even now, the story hasn't fully closed. In December 2025, Alan's attorneys filed a formal appeal. Their arguments cover much of the same ground contested at trial: that the search of Alan's home was unconstitutional, that his confessions were the product of coercive conditions during solitary confinement rather than a truthful account of events, and that the trial court's decision to exclude the alternative suspect theory denied him a fair hearing of his full defense. The Indiana Attorney General's office has filed briefs opposing each of these arguments in turn. The Indiana Court of Appeals has granted oral arguments, scheduled for September 21, 2026, at the Indiana State House, a date that, as of this telling, still lies ahead. Until that appeal is resolved, the legal story of the Delphi murders remains, in a technical but meaningful sense, unfinished. The conviction stands, the sentence stands, but the question of whether the trial itself was conducted fairly, whether the confessions should have been heard, whether the excluded alternative theory should have been allowed, whether the search of Alan's home met constitutional standards, is still being actively argued by attorneys on both sides, and will be decided by judges who have not yet ruled. There are other questions, too, that may never receive a full public answer, no matter what the appellate court decides. Why did the original eyewitness description of the man on the bridge evolve the way it did over the years? And was it represented accurately at every stage, from the initial search warrant to the trial itself? Why did a lead sheet naming Alan, based on his own words, given voluntarily just 3 days after the murders, sit unexamined for roughly 5 years while the investigation searched everywhere else? Will the ballistics evidence connecting that unspent bullet to Alan's handgun hold up to the level of scrutiny an appellate court is now applying to it? And whatever the outcome of the appeal, will the millions of people who followed this case for the better part of a decade ever feel that its ending answers all of the questions they carried for so long? What is certain, what the appeal cannot change, is this. On February 13, 2017, 2 best friends took advantage of an unexpected day off from school to walk a trail they knew well. Liberty German was 14. Abigail Williams was 13. They didn't come home that night, and the country that eventually learned their names spent nearly 6 years trying to answer the question of who took them from the people who loved them. A jury has answered that question, under the standards the law requires. An appellate court is now examining whether that answer was reached fairly. Whatever comes of that process, the fact underneath all of it stays the same. 2 girls went for a walk on an ordinary afternoon. 2 words were captured on a phone that was never meant to be evidence. And an entire town, and eventually an entire country, has spent the years since trying to understand how a single recording, 4 seconds long, became the beginning of a story that still, all these years later, refuses to be finished.